You're blocking community sightlines again, Mr. Drebin. Take it down or we escalate fines.
That was the first sentence Karen Thaylor, vice chair of the Granite Hollow Reserve HOA, hurled at me that morning before my son had even finished his juice box. She stood at the edge of my driveway, arms folded like a courthouse gargoyle. Her husband, Roan, parked behind her with his hand already resting on his hip like he was still on patrol. I stared at the low canvas windbreak I'd clipped to our backyard arbor. It wasn't new, it wasn't permanent, and it wasn't in violation. "You're not even on the architectural committee," I replied. "And this isn't a structure. It's a breathable UV-rated windscreen, medically approved. You'd know that if you hadn't ignored the exemption request." She smiled, smug and thin. "Oh, we received your little packet. But the board never had quorum, so nothing was approved, and since there's no record of denial, there's nothing to appeal either." I didn't flinch. "Then I'll assume no ruling was made, and this stays up. Before I go further, if you're a parent who's ever had to fight your HOA just to keep your kids safe, subscribe now. You're going to want to see what happens when they try to bury the truth, and forget I rebuild crime scenes for a living." "They thought I was just another quiet neighbor," I said to no one in particular as Karen's heels clicked away. "They forgot I teach courts how bullets travel. My name is Silas Drebin. I specialize in forensic animation and ballistic reconstructions. Lawyers call me when someone's freedom depends on where a shot came from, when and why it didn't match the story on the record. I don't threaten people. I just build the visual truth and let it do the talking. But none of that mattered when my son, Alric, was wheezing again in the Oregon cold. That little windbreak wasn't just fabric, it was life insurance. You see, Alric was born early. Lung fragility, weak immunity, oxygen issues. We'd spent too many nights in pediatric ICUs watching alarms light up because a breeze hit wrong. That arbor? I built it so he could safely play outside without hauling oxygen tubes. That canvas was prescribed by his pulmonologist. Not decorative, not aesthetic. Medically necessary, and Karen knew that. She'd read the exemption letter from Dr. Orvik. She'd seen the time-stamped form we submitted. She knew Rowan Thaylor wasn't legally allowed to enforce anything. His private security license expired 3 years ago, and his firearm permit hadn't been renewed in 5. And still, they stood at the edge of my life, deciding how much air my son was allowed to breathe. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, is that I never stopped recording after our last interaction. That every citation, every confrontation, every false claim had already been cataloged in a digital folder labeled Granite Hollow, Timeline of Malice. The irony? My own job taught me how to prove intent, motive, sequence. Where others saw coincidence, I saw convergence. The systematic denial of care disguised as community standards. I should have fought harder then. But a part of me thought if I kept things calm, they'd back off. That Alric smile, his laugh on that stone trail by the willow trees, was enough to hold the line. It wasn't, because 3 days later, Roan would draw his weapon, and that warning shot would change my son's life forever. It didn't hit him directly. No, it was worse than that. The round struck the edge of the stone-lined trail border, fractured, and a jagged fragment tore through the side of Alric's spine before I even realized what Roan had done. 1 second, Alric was reaching toward a squirrel. The next, he was screaming, then silent, limp in my arms. Roan said he feared for his life. But I saw his stance. I mapped his distance. I heard the pause between words. There was no fear in him, just control, just rage, just the need to make a message bleed. And Karen? She released a board newsletter the next day calling it a tragic accident following repeated non-compliance. The trail marker where it happened, once the symbol of our daily walks, was quietly vandalized the next week. Black spray paint, one word, liar. But this is the part they didn't account for. I don't bluff, I don't scream, I rebuild truth. And when the state investigators finally arrive, every frame of their cruelty will be calibrated, time-coded, and impossible to bury. I remember the first citation. It wasn't for the windbreak or the arbor, it was for a faded mailbox post. It arrived folded twice, tucked under the front door handle like a ransom note. No envelope, no explanation. Just a $50 fine and a line that read, "Non-conforming aesthetic in breach of community uniformity." That was 2 days after my first request for the medical variance. The next morning, I found a second citation taped to my gate, this time for noise complaints during prohibited hours. We don't own speakers. We don't have parties. Alric goes to bed by 7, but that didn't stop them. Karen Thaylor's name wasn't on either notice, but I knew her signature anyway, that tight cursive slash across the bottom. The way she dotted her I's below the line, like she was stabbing the paper. She didn't need to sign as HOA vice chair. Everyone knew she ran the place. Roan started showing up soon after. He parked a little too close to my driveway, engine idling, just sat there. Sometimes he'd get out and stroll the sidewalk, look over the hedges like he was casing the place. Once, I watched him pull out his phone and take pictures of the arbor from 5 different angles. He never said anything that time, just got back into the car and drove off slow, like a hunter who's already tracked the scent. My neighbors knew what was happening. You could see it in the way they avoided eye contact, in how they pulled their kids closer when walking past our house. Not because of us, but because no one wanted to be next. Granite Hollow wasn't built for neighbors. It was built for order. The streets were named after precious stones. The bylaws read like a military manual. The board called themselves Guardians of the Hollow. And Karen? She'd been on the board for 11 years. Her husband had been security at a biotech firm before something happened. No one talked about it. But ever since he retired, he'd been playing badge with our community. By the end of the month, we'd received 7 citations. 1 for a watering can left visible on the patio. 1 for improper lawn edging. Another for temporary items on the lawn. Alric's sandbox. Every one of them was filed the morning after I refused to remove the windbreak. I appealed, of course, sent the formal forms, highlighted the ADA protections, attached Dr. Orvik's letter again. I even cited Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act and the Fair Housing Act's reasonable accommodation clauses. Nothing came back. So I requested a hearing. Karen's assistant wrote that the board couldn't schedule it due to unavailable quorum. When I asked when the next quorum would be reached, I was told, "It's fluid, Mr. Drevin. You'll be informed when it's appropriate." They weren't even pretending. Every move they made was meant to exhaust me, make me give up. But they didn't understand who they were dealing with. I make my living finding inconsistencies, mapping trajectories, syncing timestamps, proving people wrong when the details don't add up. So, I started logging. I timestamped every citation, every HOA letter, every verbal confrontation. I installed a front-facing doorbell camera and motion sensors. I created a rolling spreadsheet of every single HOA violation in the neighborhood for the past 2 years, cross-referenced by street, date, and whether Karen or Roan were involved. A pattern formed faster than I expected. Elderly residents, warnings first. Families with newborns, delays, tenants, fines straight away. Single parents. Harassment escalated rapidly, especially if they asked for exceptions. But what chilled me most were the audio snippets from my doorbell logs. Roan muttering after walking past our gate. "Doesn't think the rules apply? Watch him crumble." Or Karen whispering to a board member as she dropped off a notice, "Let him film it. We'll say he was threatening." That's when I knew this wasn't just about canvas or aesthetics. This was about control, domination, making an example. But I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I didn't tear down the windbreak. I just filed everything. I named the folder Counterweight. It held every second of their abuse, and it was only just beginning. The first time I saw Desravanik hesitate, it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was a flicker, so small I almost missed it, right as Karen handed her a stack of printed violation notices at the HOA administrative office. Desra's fingers paused on the top page, the one with my address on it, like the paper itself was burning her skin. The office looked more like a private law firm than a community space. Glass walls, polished desks, framed certificates meant to intimidate anyone who sat across from them. It was supposed to be a quick meeting, just me requesting an update on my appeal status. But when I walked in, Karen was already there, leaning over Desra's shoulder, dictating which notices should go out immediately and which should be filed quietly. I stayed by the door, uninvited, listening long enough to hear my son's name. "That arbor wouldn't be an issue if he didn't keep using that child as a shield," Karen muttered. "Send the one about the patio items next. The more pressure, the better." Desra didn't respond. She just looked down at the paper, swallowed hard, and placed it in a different tray than the others. Karen didn't notice. She never looked at people unless she needed to dominate them. When Karen finally spotted me, she straightened like she'd been caught doing something holy instead of malicious. "Mr. Drevin," she said, "if you're here about the appeal, nothing has changed. No quorum, no review, no exceptions." Her voice was sharp enough to cut drywall. I walked toward the counter, keeping my tone flat. "Then I'd like the official documentation showing the denied quorum dates for my records." That's when it happened again. That flicker in Desra's expression. She froze for half a second. Her eyes darted to Karen, then to me, then back toward the tray where she'd slipped my violation notice. Karen didn't catch it. "There is no documentation," she said. "A lack of quorum doesn't require a filing. It simply prevents a vote." "That's not correct," I replied. "Your bylaws require any unscheduled deferment to be logged in the meeting record." For the first time, Desra's eyes met mine, really met mine, and she blinked like she was silently agreeing. Karen noticed that. She stepped closer to Desra, lowering her voice, but not enough to keep it from carrying across the room. "Let's remember our roles. You organize the paperwork. I interpret the bylaws." Desra's jaw tightened. I didn't interrupt. I just stood there, memorizing the tension between them. It wasn't just professional discomfort. It was fear, not of me, but of what she was being asked to hide. I asked again, "May I have the log of the variance submission date then?" This time Desra answered before Karen could cut in. "We don't have it processed yet." Karen's head snapped toward her. "What do you mean, not processed? It was marked unreceived." There it was, a crack, a tiny perfect crack in their story. I kept my expression neutral. "So, the official status is, what? Submitted but unprocessed? Or received but not logged? Because those aren't the same thing." Karen turned to me, mask hardening. "It was marked unreceived. End of discussion." "But you just said it wasn't processed," I replied. "That means your office did receive it." Desra looked physically ill now, her fingers tightening around a pen until it bent. She wasn't just conflicted, she was trapped in a contradiction Karen had created. That's when I realized something important. The power Karen held wasn't structure or authority. It was fear, fear of her, fear of retaliation, fear of losing standing in the community. And Desra was drowning in it. I didn't push further, not yet. Pressure works better when applied slowly. Instead, I nodded and said, "Thank you, that clarifies a lot." Karen scoffed. "It clarifies nothing? You're still out of compliance. Expect further notices." I left the office quietly, but as the glass door shut behind me, I caught one last glimpse of Desra. She wasn't looking at Karen. She wasn't looking at the papers. She was staring at the tray where she'd hidden my citation, staring like she'd just crossed a line she didn't know how to uncross. I didn't know then that she would become the key to everything, that her hesitation wasn't weakness. It was conscience clawing its way to the surface. But walking out into the cold air that morning, I understood one thing clearly. The HOA wasn't just abusing power, they were covering their tracks, and someone inside was starting to break under the weight of the lies. They didn't wait long to escalate. 2 days after the office encounter, I woke up to a white envelope stapled to my fence. No tape, no courtesy. Just jammed through the wood slats like someone wanted me to bleed my fingers pulling it off. The citation inside accused me of willful endangerment via unsecured child structures. Below that, a blurry photo showed Alric's collapsible play tunnel, fabric, child safe, fully portable, lying next to the arbor. Karen had circled it in red. "Improper recreational item visible from shared path," the note read. The tunnel had been there 20 minutes. Alric played with it before breakfast. It was folded and stowed before I even finished my coffee. But they'd timed it, or, more likely, Roan had. That evening, I saw him parked across the cul-de-sac in his old dark green Pathfinder. No badge, no uniform, just the same pressed shirt and the glint of something always too close to his belt. He stared at our house like it owed him something. I didn't wave, I didn't flinch, but I picked up Alric and walked him back inside. That night, I checked my perimeter camera footage. Sure enough, Roan had stepped onto my property line again, just long enough to take a photo before retreating to the sidewalk. He knew exactly how far he could push it without triggering a trespassing charge. And Karen? She used the image without comment, pretending it came from a concerned neighbor. The timing was no accident. It was a coordinated push, meant to intimidate me into silence. I filed another response. I quoted state code on temporary child accommodations. I attached photos of identical play items visible in other yards. None of them cited. Still, the next morning brought a fine. This time, the HOA doubled the amount due to repeat non-compliance and argumentative correspondence. That was their game now. Bait, fine, escalate, repeat. And Roan wasn't just watching. He was shadowing. Every walk I took with Alric, he was there. A few feet behind on the sidewalk, not speaking, just matching pace. One evening, as we passed the Stone Loop trail marker, I slowed to tie Alric's jacket and caught Roan standing near the corner, holding a dog leash with no dog. He smiled. "Evening," he said. I didn't respond. "Nice little setup you've got there. Shame if someone thought it was obstructing emergency access." That was it. No threat, no accusation. Just a quiet reminder that I was being watched, and that he could say whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted, and people would believe him. Because that's what they do to men like me. Quiet men, widowers, outliers, they push until you break. Then they use your reaction as evidence that you were dangerous all along. But I didn't break. Instead, I documented everything. I added Roan's phrase, obstructing emergency access, to the folder. I included a timestamp, location coordinates, ambient audio level. I'd done this work for years, compiling subtle inconsistencies in security incident reports, discrediting inflated claims from corporations who thought no one would check the angles. And now I was doing it for the one case that mattered most. Alric had no idea. He still giggled in the stroller, still pointed at squirrels and asked for juice boxes with the pirate straw. But I noticed he looked over his shoulder now. He'd seen Roan too many times. He felt what I couldn't explain. That's when I knew this was no longer about HOA fines or bylaws. It was about safety. Not in the legal sense, real safety. The kind you feel when you sit outside without scanning every window, when your kid can play without someone calling it a violation. I told myself I'd hold the line, that as long as they kept it verbal, procedural, political, I could endure it. But even then, even as I repeated that lie in my head, I knew what was coming. Karen's patience was running thin. And Roan? He wasn't circling anymore. He was closing in. The appointment with Dr. Orvik wasn't supposed to reveal anything new. It was just a routine check-in for Alric. Lungs, vitals, a quick conversation about wind exposure and his upcoming immunotherapy round. But 15 minutes into the visit, the conversation shifted. "I never heard back from your HOA," she said, scrolling through her digital chart. "Strange, considering I submitted the medical exemption request. Myself. Did they approve it?" I blinked. "Wait, you submitted it directly?" She nodded, tapping the screen. "Yep. From my clinic account, I filled out their template, attached Alric's medical summary, and sent it to the address listed in their guidelines. I even received the auto receipt." My pulse slowed. "They told me it wasn't processed, then said it was never received. Now it's marked unreceived." Dr. Orvik frowned. "No, they received it. I remember it was the same week we had the cold snap and I expedited a few cases. I never got a bounce back." She turned the screen toward me. There it was, a digital PDF sent directly to the HOA's official email, time-stamped and archived under Alric's name. It had everything. The diagnosis code, medical necessity language, and even the formal request for ADA consideration under federal law. I stared at the screen like it might vanish. That form was the difference between a community disagreement and a civil rights violation, between HOA overreach and ADA noncompliance, between a misunderstanding and deliberate obstruction. They had received it, they had ignored it, and then they weaponized that silence to call us non-compliant. I left the clinic with more than a follow-up date. I had the first piece of formal evidence that Karen's board wasn't just cruel, they were fraudulent. I pulled over in the parking lot, forwarded the file to 3 places, my own server, my legal archive, and a new folder I'd labeled ADA Submission Suppression. When I got home, I dug into the HOA's community charter. Buried in the digital bylaws was a clause requiring any medical-based variance request to be acknowledged within 10 business days. There was no mention of quorum as a requirement for acknowledgement, only for vote-based decisions. Acknowledgement was mandatory, They hadn't missed the deadline by a few days. They were 37 business days late. That night, I searched public records for Granite Hollow's HOA filings. The email listed for submissions had not changed in 6 years. There had been no redirect, no website outage, no listed downtime. I printed everything, highlighted every clause, cross-referenced every date. For a while, I just stared at it, the maze of missteps, omissions, and manipulations. Then I thought about the phrase Karen had used in the HOA office. It was marked unreceived. That wasn't just a lie. It was a quiet rewrite of the record. Someone had gone into the meeting log and deliberately altered the submission line, either deleted the timestamp or filed it under another category to obscure it. And Desra had paused when I asked for the log. She knew. She may not have been the one to bury it, but she had seen the burial. I didn't call her, not yet, but I added a new tab in my spreadsheet, Witness Possibility. I logged her reactions, her inconsistencies, and that quiet look she'd given me when Karen had spoken. For her. The more I pieced it together, the more I realized the truth wasn't buried in shadows. It was sitting just beneath the surface, held there by fear and bureaucracy. The HOA hadn't just failed to protect my son, they'd created the conditions that endangered him. And they did it while pretending the system was fair. But systems are like evidence. They're only as strong as the people willing to test them. And I was done waiting. The morning was still when it happened. No wind, no warnings. Just the slow roll of stroller wheels along the stone trail, and the soft rustle of leaves as Alric reached out toward a squirrel darting into the brush. I hadn't noticed Roan at first. He was further up the path, hands in his jacket pockets, posture too relaxed to be accidental. I knew that stance. It was the same one security personnel use when they're pretending not to watch, but tracking every move. I adjusted the stroller, pulling the sunshade lower to block the morning glare. Alric was giggling, the kind of deep, carefree laugh that only ever came when we were outside. It was rare now, and I didn't dare ruin it with my worry. But Roan stepped forward. "Didn't expect you to be out so soon," he called. I kept my voice even. "Didn't expect you to be lurking by the trail again." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Just keeping an eye on things. You never know who might break the rules next." The words hit colder than the air. I started to pivot the stroller around when I heard the shift of gravel, Roan's feet planted. "Where do you think you're going, Silas?" I froze, not because I was afraid of him, but because Alric was between us, strapped into the stroller, hands still outstretched toward the bushes. "You need to step back," I said. "You're on a public path, but you're 2 feet from my son. That's a line." Roan reached into his jacket slowly, too slow. And then I saw the glint. Not a phone, not a badge, metal. He drew it fast, one-handed, practiced, and aimed low. Not at me, not at Alric, at the ground. A foot to the right of the stroller. He fired. The shot cracked through the trees like lightning splitting stone. Birds exploded from the branches. Somewhere, a dog started barking. Alric screamed. I lunged. There was no time to think, no time to measure angles or intent. I dropped to the ground, arms over Alric, my body coiled around his like armor. Silence followed the echo. Then a sound I'll never forget. A gasp that gurgled into stillness. Alric's hand had fallen limp. I pulled back and saw it, the blood spreading fast from his side, staining the gray of his jacket. No visible entry wound at first, just red soaking the fabric where the bullet fragment had found him. I scooped him up. Roan stepped back, muttering something. Maybe a warning, maybe an excuse, but I didn't register it. My focus tunneled. I pressed my palm to Alric's side and ran. The path blurred beneath me. I shouted for help, but the trees answered with silence. By the time I reached the road, a neighbor was already outside. She saw the blood, the look on my face, and didn't ask a single question. She handed me her phone and dialed 911 without a word. The paramedics arrived in 6 minutes. Alric's blood pressure had dropped by the time they loaded him into the ambulance. They couldn't say how bad it was. The fragment had hit near the lower spine. They were stabilizing, transporting, working fast. I followed in my car, hands shaking, knees locked, brain barely holding together. Every traffic light felt like a curse. Every second that passed felt like it dragged part of me away. The emergency room was chaos, fluorescent lights, shouting, metal, monitors beeping. I signed paperwork on autopilot, gave medical history, explained his condition, answered the same questions 3 times. And then I waited. It was 3 hours before the surgeon came out, face drawn. "He's stable," she said. Then, softer. "But there's spinal damage, partial, maybe more. We won't know the full extent until swelling goes down." I nodded, but the words didn't land. Spinal damage. 2 words that cut deeper than any bullet. When they finally let me see him, Alric was small beneath the blankets. A monitor beeped steadily beside his bed. His chest rose and fell in rhythm, but his legs didn't move. I sat beside him, holding his hand, listening to the machine's hum. And I made a decision. They did this. Not just Roan, not just Karen, the entire system that let it happen. The silence, the manipulation, the lies disguised as rules. They had crossed a line that no citation could erase, and I was done waiting for justice. I was going to bring it. I didn't expect to see Desra Vanek at the hospital. It was the second evening after Alric's surgery. He was still unconscious, sedated for pain management, a tiny brace running from his ribcage to the curve of his hip. The room had settled into that artificial stillness hospitals cultivate, machines humming, fluorescent lights buzzing faintly, the occasional cough from down the hall. I was half asleep in the visitor's chair when a quiet knock pulled me upright. She stood there in civilian clothes, clutching a brown folder against her chest like it might crumble if she let go. For a second, I thought maybe I was hallucinating. But then she spoke. "I shouldn't be here," she said. I didn't argue. I just moved aside. Desra stepped in cautiously, eyes landing on Alric's still form in the bed. Her mouth trembled slightly. It wasn't performative. It looked like someone finally letting the guilt settle in. "I heard what happened," she said. "I was there when Karen briefed the board. She said Roan felt threatened, that he didn't aim at your son, that it was just a warning shot." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. She kept talking. But she didn't mention the trail marker, or how close Roan was, or that he'd been following you for weeks. She left all of that out, just said you were escalating. "She always edits the truth," I said. "I'm just surprised anyone noticed." Desra sat slowly in the chair across from mine, still clutching the folder. I wasn't going to say anything. Honestly, I tried to stay out of it. But when I heard they were preparing to label you unstable, that they planned to submit a report to Child Protective Services claiming you were weaponizing your son's disability, I couldn't stay quiet. That landed hard. I blinked once, letting the words absorb. "Karen said that?" "She drafted the language herself," Desra whispered. "It's already scheduled to be filed if you contest the fines in court. The board will claim you're creating a hostile environment and using medical exemptions to justify unsafe behavior." I leaned forward. "So, they shoot my kid and try to say it's my fault?" She flinched but nodded. Then she finally opened the folder. Inside were copies of board emails, handwritten meeting notes, a digital printout of the original variance request submitted by Dr. Orvik, with its correct timestamp and the received tag from the HOA inbox. "I pulled what I could before they lock me out," she said. "I'm resigning tomorrow. They'll change the system access by end of day." I reached for the papers, scanning each page carefully. One email stood out. Karen's subject line was chilling. "Let it ride." He's one of those types. Pressure will crack him before lawyers get involved. Below it, an attachment labeled Preliminary Escalation Plan, Dreven Household. My throat tightened. "How long have they been building this?" I asked. "Since your first citation," Desra said. "Karen's been using your case as a prototype. If it worked on you, she'd use it on others." One of the board members joked they should turn it into a violation response flowchart. Alric stirred faintly in his bed, a soft whimper escaping through his mask. I stood instinctively, hand on his, and Desra fell silent. After a minute, when his breathing settled again, I turned back to her. "You understand what you're giving me," I said. "This isn't just misconduct. This is obstruction, retaliation, maybe criminal negligence." "I know," she whispered, "and I'm ready to testify if you need me to." For the first time in weeks, the weight in my chest shifted. I hadn't just collected data. Now I had a voice from the inside. Not a document, not a timestamp, a person, someone who had watched it happen and decided enough was enough. Desra stood to leave, her expression tight. "I'm sorry it took me this long," she said. "I saw the signs and I looked away." I shook my head. "You're here now. That's what matters." She nodded once, pulled her coat tighter, and disappeared down the hall. I sat back down beside my son, folder in hand, and opened a new file on my laptop. Granite Hollow, witness evidence log. The war they started with paper. I was ending with proof. The first thing I did was reconstruct the trail. I started with the raw footage from my body-mounted clip cam, something I'd installed discreetly weeks ago. Not for paranoia, just pattern tracking. Roan had a habit of stepping into my space when no one was watching. I wanted a record. I layered the audio over a high-res scan of the Stone Loop Trail, captured via a drone pass I'd commissioned for an unrelated work contract. Then I pulled in the site measurements I'd taken that night. After the police left, after Alric had been airlifted to the children's trauma unit, the path was exactly 48 inches wide. Roan had been standing 19 inches from the stroller. His shot struck the second stone on the left edge of the trail, angled slightly upward, based on the deflection chip and the embedded copper shavings I'd collected before the cleanup crew arrived. The police hadn't even noticed them. I had. I built the scene frame by frame, the shot angle, the impact depth, the fragmentation pattern, the exact point where the copper split, one fragment burying into a fence post, another spinning into Alric's side. The model didn't lie. It wasn't a warning shot. It was reckless endangerment with direct consequence. I overlaid time codes, trajectory arcs, thermal maps. Created a full 3D reconstruction using the same software used in courtrooms across the country. Every frame could be verified, matched to the metadata, linked to chain of custody documentation. This wasn't guesswork. This was forensic fact. I named the file Incident Alpha Dreven Devrag A. Sauber. Yes, Thaylor, Sequence R01. Next came the ADA packet. Dr. Orvik sent me a notarized statement verifying her submission date. Along with a follow-up she'd sent a week later when no response came. I included a screenshot of the HOA bylaws, the 10 business day acknowledgement clause. Then I printed the section of the Fair Housing Act requiring reasonable accommodations for disabilities under both physical and environmental hardship clauses. I didn't embellish, I didn't theorize, I just attached the evidence. Time-stamped, authenticated, irrefutable. Then I built the timeline. It started with the first citation, the mailbox, and followed each violation, each escalation, every instance where Roan trespassed, photographed, or harassed. I included Roan's parking logs, pulled from public-facing license plate trackers on the community gate cam. He had driven by our house 19 times in a single month. That wasn't community concern, that was surveillance. I labeled that file Behavioral Poor Pattern Mapping Thaylor, Subject Marzoa 1. Finally, I compiled Desra's folder, meeting notes, emails, the internal escalation plan, Karen's direct quote about cracking me under pressure. I included it all, chronologically, cross-referenced. To a stranger, it might have looked obsessive, but to a federal agency, it was a roadmap of coordinated retaliation. I spent 2 days doing nothing else. I barely left the hospital. I reviewed the files while sitting beside Alric's bed, listening to his machines breathe for him. He'd started to wake in short moments, drifting in and out. He didn't ask about the trail. He didn't ask why his legs wouldn't move, but he knew. He stared at me differently now, not afraid, just aware, like something had shifted in both of us. I built the submission package next, 2 copies, one for the Oregon Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, one for the Regional ADA Enforcement Office. Both agencies had protocols for retaliation-based accommodation denial. I followed them to the letter, every form, every attachment, every certification of authenticity. I even had 3 separate professionals, one trauma surgeon, one pediatric disability advocate, and one ADA compliance officer, review the contents and sign third-party declarations. Not opinion, verification. By the time I was done, I had a 3-layered system. Physical evidence, procedural violations, and human testimony. All of it nested inside a 256-bit encrypted archive backed up to cloud, flash, and 2 secure local drives. When I zipped the final archive, I named it Stone Loop Truth, .ekg. It was the most important case I'd ever built. And this time, the courtroom wasn't abstract. This time, the blood was my son's. Before I filed the evidence, I needed one final layer of insulation. If I submitted everything now and they buried it, or worse, claimed I falsified something, I'd be the one standing alone while they paraded their version of events through local news and courtrooms. Karen wasn't stupid. She'd built this HOA fortress to protect her own from accountability. And if Roan could fire a round that paralyzed a toddler without being arrested on the spot, I had no illusions about how far they'd stretch the narrative once the spotlight hit. So I made sure the light was ready to stay on. I started by canvassing the neighborhood, not loudly, not with signs or confrontation. Quiet conversations, short, intentional. I spoke to the retired vet on Lapis Lane, who'd told me weeks ago that Roan had shouted at his granddaughter for rollerblading on the sidewalk. I spoke to the couple on Quartz Bend who'd stopped bringing their dog to the trail after Karen's off-leash threats became weekly citations. I asked them for their stories, not rumors, just times, dates, brief descriptions. Many didn't want their names attached. I understood. Karen had built a regime, not a board. But they gave me enough to draw consistent patterns. Roan acting without oversight. Karen filing citations for items not visible from public space. Selective enforcement, targeted escalation. I logged everything into a file labeled Community Behavior Affidavits, Anonymous, and linked each entry to the HOA's own public violation report dates. Several overlapped perfectly. Then came the final piece, proving Roan's proximity pattern. I submitted a request to the gate system vendor. They maintained the vehicle log for the Granite Hollow security arms. Every entry and exit was time-stamped and matched to license plates. I wasn't legally entitled to the entire database, but I requested my own property's entry logs under the community's transparency clause. To my surprise, they granted it. Roan's Pathfinder had passed my home perimeter 34 times in 24 days. He wasn't checking the community. He was tracking me. To reinforce the point, I had two of my clients, trial attorneys who'd used my forensic reconstructions before, review the data as external observers. Both agreed to write summary memos confirming that Roan's pattern showed clear behavior consistent with surveillance, not neighborhood patrol. Their names carried weight. They'd both testified in federal cases. By now, I had over 400 pages of raw and secondary evidence. I compiled the package onto an encrypted drive and prepped 3 identical copies. One for DOJ Civil Rights, one for the ADA office, one for my legal archive. But I didn't stop there. I sent a courtesy copy to the law firm retained by the HOA, the one that issued all their community notices. Not with threat, not with demand, just a plain statement. Please see attached. Formal complaint submission in progress. Opportunity to respond will be available once state intake confirms review. It took less than 12 hours for Karen to email the neighborhood. A regrettable escalation has occurred regarding Mr. Drevin. We urge the community to remain calm as we explore mediation. The board remains committed to safety and fairness. She was scrambling. Good. Because the next day, I received a response from the DOJ's Civil Rights Intake Officer. They acknowledged receipt, assigned a case number, and asked for interview availability within the week. That night, I sat beside Alric again. He was awake longer now, still couldn't sit up without help, but his voice had returned, small, uncertain, but his. "Are we going home soon?" he asked. "Soon," I said, brushing his hair back. "But when we do, things are going to be different." He blinked slowly. "Are they still mad?" "They're scared now," I whispered. I meant it. Not because I wanted revenge, but because they knew the game had changed. This wasn't just a neighbor who refused to fall in line. This was a man who knew how to rebuild truth from debris. And I'd just finished the blueprint. I didn't sleep the night before the interviews. Not because I was nervous. There was nothing left to explain. The truth had already been rendered, frame by frame. But I knew the next 24 hours would cement whether this was a battle I'd win with quiet precision or one that would end in fire. The DOJ call came first. Agent Caldwell, calm voice, clipped tone, someone who'd seen too many cases like mine and already knew how patterns became policy. "I've reviewed the archive," he said. "Your documentation exceeds what we usually receive. That's not a compliment. It's an indictment of how little effort most people are capable of producing when they're in crisis." I appreciated the honesty. We spoke for an hour. He walked through the forensic reconstruction, the ADA submission timeline, the selective enforcement patterns. He didn't interrupt much, just took notes, confirmed a few entries. At the end, he said, "This won't be a quick process, but based on what I've seen, there is enough here to warrant formal inquiry into retaliation and failure to accommodate." That was all I needed. The second interview came from the ADA enforcement team. They were more specific. They requested 3 follow-up exhibits, including the raw footage of Rowan's approach before the shot and Desra's handwritten meeting log. I uploaded everything in real time while they were still on the line. They asked about Ulrich. I hesitated, then answered plainly. "He's adjusting. He wakes up quieter now. Doesn't ask about the trail anymore." There was silence on the other end, then a clipped acknowledgement and confirmation of next steps. By the end of the day, I had 2 formal confirmation letters, one federal and one state. Both had opened files. Both had assigned investigators. Both had informed the HOA, per policy. And that's when it began. Karen's tone shifted overnight. A notice went out to the entire community. It was full of empty phrases. Committed to resolution, deeply regret unfortunate incident. Working closely with authorities. She still didn't use Ulrich's name. Still didn't mention the shot, but she was sweating now. That same evening, I received an email from the HOA's legal counsel, an offer to mediate the situation. No liability, no apology, just a discussion-based resolution pathway. I declined, politely, formally. The next step was preparing for the public board meeting. It was the quarterly session, already scheduled, but now under review by state ADA observers. They wouldn't attend officially, but their presence would be felt. So, I made it count. I submitted my speaker request form as required, 7 minutes of floor time. That's all they'd allow. I spent the next 2 days preparing every word. I didn't bring a slideshow, didn't bring printed handouts. That wasn't the point. I wasn't there to explain anymore. I was there to make sure every neighbor who'd been silent finally saw the cost of looking away. The night of the meeting, the community hall was packed, more than I'd ever seen. Desra was there, seated quietly in the back row, no longer part of the board, but not hiding either. Roan didn't show. Karen sat at the head of the table, flanked by the remaining board members, like a monarch pretending her crown wasn't melting. My name was called. I stood. I didn't speak immediately. Just set down the folder labeled Verified Submissions. Let them see the spine of it, thick with authenticated declarations, forensic diagrams, and copies of every law they'd violated. Then I began. Not with anger, not with blame, but with Ulrich's name. I told them what he remembered. I told them how he used to love the wind, how the cold felt like play to him, not danger. I told them about the laugh he made when we first found the trail, how he'd point at the stone marker and say, "That's our turn." Then I told them what happened after, the shot, the blood, the silence that followed. I read the direct quote from Karen's email aloud, the one about pressure cracking people. I watched her flinch. I watched the room shift. When I finished, I didn't ask for a response. I just walked off the stage and left the folder at the table's edge. 7 minutes. That's all it took to drain the myth from the board. 7 minutes to let truth echo louder than authority. Karen didn't speak at first. She didn't look at me when I sat down. Her eyes stayed on the folder I'd placed on the board table, like it was a live device. One false move, and the whole thing might explode. Beside her, 2 board members exchanged a glance. One adjusted his collar. The other cleared his throat but said nothing. The room had shifted. There was no applause after I spoke, no gasps. Just silence, tight, uncomfortable, and impossibly loud. Then came the scraping of a chair. Desra stood up from the back row. She walked slowly toward the front, face pale but steady. In her hand, she held a small envelope. She didn't hand it to me. She didn't address the board. She placed it on the table in front of everyone, pressed her palm to it for a second, then let go. "I resigned 2 weeks ago," she said, voice low. "But I kept copies, every version of the minutes, every email I was asked to reformat, every file I was told to backdate." Karen's head lifted like a puppet on strings. "You're not a board member," she snapped. "You're not authorized to—" "Neither is Roan," Desra interrupted. The words landed with a jolt. A few neighbors in the crowd murmured, heads turning. "He's not on the board. He's not certified. And yet, there are 8 incident reports with his signature, 3 of them involved citations, 2 involved verbal confrontations, 1 involved a child, mine, my daughter, last spring. He cornered her on the path and demanded her name. She cried for days. Karen stood now, but Desra didn't back down. You told me to log that as general community concern. You made me change the language. I did it. I regret it. Her voice cracked then, not from weakness, but from years of silence clawing its way out. And now, there's a little boy who may never walk again. Karen's response was sharp and practiced. These accusations are defamatory. We've followed procedure. We've cooperated with every inquiry. No, I said. You've obstructed every one of them. I stepped forward, pulling a small drive from my jacket pocket. This is the complete reconstruction. Roan was within 19 inches of my son. He fired into a stone-lined path. The fragment trajectory is mapped, verified, and already in DOJ hands. Karen looked toward the lawyer seated near the door. HOA counsel, brought in for damage control. He didn't stand, he didn't speak, because there was nothing left to control. One of the board members, a younger guy named Everett, leaned forward, voice hoarse. Is it true? He asked Karen. Did you really suppress the medical request? Karen's jaw flexed. We followed quorum protocol. There was no quorum required for acknowledgement, Desra said. That's in the bylaws, section 4.1b. I highlighted it in yellow the day we received the email from Dr. Orvik. Karen told me to move it to a pending folder and delete the log. I did. I regret that too. It was crumbling fast now, the illusion of order, the tight control. A hand went up in the audience. I have a question, a woman said. I recognized her, Emma from Quartz Bend. Are we liable? Karen didn't answer. Everett looked at me. What happens next? I let the question sit a moment. Next, I said, you'll receive formal notice of the federal investigation, civil rights violations, ADA retaliation, and likely a state-level inquiry for obstruction and harassment. There may be individual liability depending on who knew what and when. The lawyer finally spoke. We'll need to adjourn and consult. No, another board member said. We don't get to hide behind closed doors anymore. Karen's voice rose, brittle. You're overreacting. This isn't a criminal matter. A voice from the far end of the room answered her. I was subpoenaed this morning, Desra said. You might want to check your mail. That was it. The board didn't vote. They didn't need to. Karen sat down, pale, hands trembling. She knew. This wasn't a neighborhood squabble. This was federal. This was truth with weight. And this time, it had gravity she couldn't escape. The news broke 3 days later. It wasn't a headline. It was a legal notice tucked in the state's digital bulletin. But in a community built on whispers, that was enough. Granite Hollow Reserve, HOA. Under federal investigation for ADA violations and retaliatory harassment. For a few hours, the neighborhood was silent. No lawnmowers, no committee emails, no evening dog walkers on the trail. Just stillness, the kind that follows a siren after it's faded into the distance. Karen resigned that night, not formally, no statement, no farewell, but quietly, slipping a one-line message into the community portal at 2:17 a.m. Effective. Immediately, I will not be seeking continuation of board duties. Roan was taken into custody the next morning. Reckless endangerment, unlawful discharge of a firearm, impersonation of a security officer. The sheriff's office didn't even send a cruiser into Granite Hollow. They arrested him at his own front door. I watched from across the cul-de-sac as 2 deputies led him away. No one intervened, no one spoke. The same neighbors who once avoided eye contact now stood on their lawns, watching the man who made everyone afraid finally lose his power. By the end of the week, the entire board had dissolved. The state appointed a provisional administrator to oversee property management until a new one could be elected. ADA inspectors came in pairs, measuring access points, safety railings, community areas. They treated the case like precedent, which I later learned it would become. The Stone Loop trail marker, once vandalized and cordoned off, was restored under state supervision. The graffiti was sandblasted away, the cracks filled. A new plaque was added without me asking for it. I found out about it from a maintenance worker who'd quietly followed our story. It read, "To Alric Drevin, whose laughter proved stronger than silence. When I wheeled him down that trail for the first time since the shooting, he didn't ask about the blood or the noise. He just stared at the new plaque, his small hands gripping the arms of his chair. The wind picked up, brushing his hair back, and for a moment, I could almost see him standing again, the way he used to, chasing that same squirrel past the trees. He smiled. Not big, just enough to break the weight that had been living on my chest for months. Desra joined us later that day. She'd testified, cooperated, and refused protective anonymity. Her decision gave other residents courage. They voted for a new board, neighbors who'd been too quiet for too long. One of them asked me to serve as an advisor, to help draft new accessibility standards for families in the community. I agreed, not out of revenge, but because change meant nothing if it didn't outlive the damage. Karen never appeared again. Rumor said she moved out of state, changed her name, tried to sell the house under market value. But everyone knew no buyer would touch Granite Hollow without reading the case file. Her legacy was now permanent, but not the way she wanted. As for Roan, the trial didn't last long. The forensic reconstruction was irrefutable, the evidence airtight. His attorney tried to claim it was a misfire, a ricochet, a tragic fluke, but the animation left no room for doubt. One shot, deliberate, reckless, preventable. The jury didn't take an hour to convict. The day the verdict came, I was at the hospital. Alric was in therapy, learning to balance again, his hands gripping the bars with trembling determination. He looked at me between exercises and said, "I can still play, Dad, just different now." I nodded, unable to speak, because somehow in his small voice, he'd already done what I'd spent months trying to achieve, turn pain into motion. That night, as the house grew quiet, I opened the final file on my computer. Stone Loop Truth, Do Tg. I clicked delete, not because I wanted to forget, but because it had served its purpose. Justice wasn't in the files anymore. It was here, breathing, healing, moving forward. Granite Hollow would never be the same again. It wasn't supposed to be. If you've ever faced someone who thought power meant immunity, remember this story. Truth doesn't vanish when buried. It compresses. And when it breaks free, it hits with force no bullet ever could. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?